To adopt overlay zoning based off the Tequesta Commercial Corridor Master Plan. And Keith, I'll hand this out to you, and I think you should take a drink of water before you read this one.
Come back in about 20 minutes and I'll be through it.
Very long.
Thank you, Mayor. This is Ordinance 0124. This is first reading. This is an ordinance of the Village Council of the Village of Tequesta, Florida, amending the Code of Ordinances, Chapter 78, Zoning, to adopt new overlay zoning that implements certain recommendations contained in the October 2022 Village of Tequesta Commercial Corridor Master Plan, prepared by the Treasure Coast Regional Planning Council, adopted by the Village Council on November 10th, 2022, specifically amending the following sections. 78.4 definitions. By adopting new definitions for formula business, formula restaurant, overlay district, facade transparency, and civic open space. Section 7896, discontinuance of nonconforming uses, by adding language to explain continuation of nonconforming uses in an overlay zone. 78-176, C1 neighborhood commercial district, by adding permitted and special exception use regulations applicable to overlay zoning. Section 78-177, C2 community commercial district, by adding permitted and special exception use regulations applicable to overlay zoning. Section 78-178, C3 general commercial district, by adding permitted and special exception use regulations applicable to overlay zoning. Section 78-180 MU mixed use district, by adding permitted and special exception use regulations applicable to overlay zoning and resolving conflict between MU zoning and overlay zoning in favor of overlay zoning. Further, creating an entirely new Article 6, Division 3, entitled Overlay Districts, with new code sections 78-201 through 78-204. Adopting section 78-201, Tequesta Drive overlay, creating and defining this overlay district, providing purpose and intent, providing design, setback, facade, parking, formula business and restaurant, open space and landscaping guidelines, providing for payment in lieu of certain open space requirements, providing for waivers, resolving any conflict between general regulations and overlay zoning regulations in favor of overlay zoning regulations. Also adopting section 78-202, U.S. Highway 1 overlay, creating and defining this overlay district, providing purpose and intent, providing design, setback, facade, parking, formula business and restaurant, open space and landscaping guidelines, providing for payment in lieu of certain open space requirements, providing for waivers, resolving any conflict between general regulations and overlay zoning regulations in favor of overlay zoning regulations. Also adopting section 78-203, Village Center overlay, creating and defining this overlay district, providing purpose and intent, providing design, setback, facade, parking, formula business and restaurant, open space and landscaping guidelines, providing for payment in lieu of certain open space requirements, providing for waivers, resolving any conflict between general regulations and overlay zoning regulations in favor of overlay zoning regulations, and adopting section 78-204, waivers, to provide a process for obtaining waivers from the Village Council for certain overlay district requirements, providing for an application, providing criteria for the granting of a waiver, providing that each and every other section, subsection, chapter 78 shall remain in full force and effect as previously adopted, providing conflicts clause, severability clause, authority to codify an effective date, and for other purposes.
Thank you, Keith. Lance.
Good evening, Madam Mayor, council members. First off, congratulations to everyone. For the record, my name is Lance Lilly. I am a senior planner with Chenmore & Associates, as well as I am helping the Village Community Development Department. Before I start, I'd like to ask the Mayor, how would you like me to go through this presentation? Do you want me to stop after each overlay like we've done for workshops, or do you just want me to go through the whole presentation?
I mean, Council, we've had many meetings on this. I think I'd be comfortable going through the whole thing and then questions at the end. Does everyone agree, or would you rather?
I'm flexible, but I'm fine if you want to start with going through the whole thing.
Makes sense to me.
That's fine. I've got questions.
Yeah, just run through the whole thing.
Okay. So just to start, this is, as Keith read into the record, Ordinance 124. This is the proposed code text amendment for commercial overlays based on the Treasure Coast's Commercial Corridor Master Plan. So just to start, in 2022, Treasure Coast came through and they did a 5-day charrette to obtain feedback from the residents in the community. After that, they molded this document, which is the Treasure Coast Plan that was adopted in November of 2022. Following that, there was meetings with Mr. Allen as well as Dana Little for the next steps of how the ordinance can be drafted and come to play. Presentations was then put together by Mr. Little to the P&Z board last year, March 16th. Following that, there were several meetings. As mentioned, one was May 30th of last year, July 31st, December 4th, and January 29th of this year. Following those workshops, we had a presentation with the Planning and Zoning / LPA on February the 15th of this year, as well as a LPA hearing for the recommendation of this ordinance. What were some of the key recommendations that was put together from Treasure Coast? They talked about district centers, frontage standards, civic open space, measuring of height, drive-through buildings and gas stations, location of parking, and primary streets. So since you've last seen this ordinance, since you've last seen this code text amendment, we've included some things to the ordinance. Previously, there was a 1250 square footage threshold for formula businesses and restaurants that has since been removed. We've also included the civic open space to allow that to be counted towards the landscape open space requirements. We've also included the payment in lieu, which was discussed, and we have a threshold of 2 acres or less. And for developments in the mixed-use zoning district, we put a 2080 residential code clarification in there. It's already in the comprehensive plan as it is right now. We also talked about potentially including some type of caveat, which would be for specific circumstances as well as parcel sizes. Lastly, we included that there would be one formula restaurant in a development that is larger than 2 acres in the village center, and that would be via special exception, and those would be examples maybe like a Capital Grill, Roof Chris, Nobu, something like that. That would be not your typical like fast food restaurant, but maybe like a high-end, high-scale type of restaurant in that particular area. Following that, we brought this to the LPA, and LPA actually had a few recommendations for this council. They mentioned that we should update the definition of civic open space to include some type of provision for hours of operation in a sense. They didn't want just random people to be there past 10, 11, whatever time. They wanted some type of solidified number. Update the code, which was 2285 as well as 78204, to include some type of clarification that the Planning and Zoning Board also does make recommendations for the waivers to council. They wanted to reduce the size of the payment of lieu from 2 acres to 1 acre. Include some type of restriction that would say no artificial turf in the civic open spaces. Include a provision that the village council does not have to accept the maintenance of civic open spaces. And then also just include some type of quantified number of those specific criteria for the mixed use. So you're pretty familiar with this. This is the map that Treasure Coast put together. It had 3 overlay districts, one on the bottom right, one to the left, and one to the north. Our overlay district is very similar. We have the Tequesta Drive overlay, the US 1 overlay, as well as the Village Center, which is depicted in those different colors. First, we'll start off with Tequesta Drive overlay. In Tequesta Drive overlay, the allowable zoning districts that are there currently is C1, C2, and C3, as depicted on the legend. And what would the intent of this be? To preserve and protect the local hometown village character. In this particular overlay, formula restaurants would be prohibited. Formula businesses would be permitted, but via special exception use, meaning that it'd have to come before this council. We'd like to have a small scale character and charm, facades to be closer to the corridor, parking to be in the rear, and then to include some type of civic open spaces, landscapes, and tree canopies. Currently, this is what the code says as far as the C1, C2, and C3 zoning districts. As depicted in the yellow, the minimum front setback is 15 feet for C1, 25 feet for C2, and 15 feet for C3. As this ordinance is written, we are, instead of doing minimums, we're doing maximums. So the maximum would be a maximum of 20 feet from the property line. And then also we have a provision in the code currently that has it that you have to have a 15-foot landscape buffer. So essentially if someone were to come in tomorrow and said they wanted to potentially put a new development in, they'd have to abide by this code However, if they do include some of the frontage standards, then they can encroach into that minimum landscape buffer. These are the different frontage types, which were also depicted in this Treasure Coast plan. In Tequesta Drive West, porches would be allowed, stoops would be allowed, bracketed balconies would not, forecourts, yes, arcades, no, and shop fronts, yes. If you were in Seabrook, it'd be yes for porches, stoops, yes, bracketed balconies, no. They're pretty similar as you go through. Forecourts, yes, arcades, no, shop fronts, no, and then Cypress would be no for porches, stoops, no, bracketed balconies, no, forecourts, yes, arcades, no, and shop fronts would be yes. And then for this, it would be for primary and secondary streets. Primary streets would be Tequesta Drive, Seabrook, and Cypress. Anything else within that particular overlay would be a secondary street. So then we talk about formula restaurants and formula businesses. So formula restaurants would be essentially a chain or a group of 3 or more restaurants in the nation, and typically it'd have one of 2 of these 3 descriptions. It can have a same or similar name, trademark, or trade name, standardized or limited menu, ingredients, food, beverage preparation, or it can have some type of similar exterior design, architecture, interior design, or uniforms. And then formula businesses would be an establishment that offers healthcare, medical, dental, retail, personal services, real estate services, and it pretty much would be a chain similar to the restaurants. On the left-hand side, formula, as mentioned, formula businesses are permitted via special exception use, and that's actually through all 3 overlays. And there is no threshold as far as square footage. However, on the bottom, formula restaurants would be permitted via special exception use in the US 1 overlay, as well as developments that are 2 acres or more in the village center overlay. So some of the examples of these changes. So village center and US 1 both have that mixed use overlay or mixed use zoning district that's there. Under the existing zoning code, the special exception, so these criteria on the left-hand side, if you happen to exceed 5,000 square feet or above, they're considered a special exception use. So let's say, for example, a barber shop wanted to come in and a barber shop exceeded that 5,000 square feet. Then, by virtue of the code currently, that would require a special exception use. And then also, fast food restaurants in general, as it's written right now in the code, are only allowed on US 1, and there be a special exception use. However, with this particular overlay, with the village center and US 1 overlay, any business that meets the definition of formula business would require a special exception use, no matter the size. Also, under the village center and US 1 overlay, formula restaurants is a special exception use for properties on the US 1 overlay, as well as developments that would be 2 acres or larger in the village center overlay. So I just mentioned this definition. Currently, our definition includes healthcare, medical, dental, retail, and personal services. So personal services, as I mentioned, like a barbershop, maybe if Supercuts or something like that wanted to come in, that would meet that criteria. However, it does not contemplate like financial institutions, so let's say Chase Bank or PNC or something like that. Currently, that's how the code is written, or the ordinance is written. I'm not sure if council would like to include financial institutions or leave it the way it is. That's just something that you guys could consider as I go through this presentation. So, formula businesses and formula restaurants. Currently, for special exception uses, it has a specific criteria that an applicant would have to bring before council, and they would have to essentially explain how they meet those criteria. If an applicant decides that they'd like to do a formula business or a formula restaurant, we have included this criteria, which would, 1, make sure they meet the special exception criteria that's already in the code, but then also include some of these other provisions, such as no altering of the village identity in that particular district, that they'd have to contribute some type of diverse or appropriate blend of business within that district, complementary of uses, be compatible, preserve the character, have some type of facade or design that's compatible, and then also the business corporate structure would have to have some type of harmonious aspect to that particular district. So as I mentioned, so we have frontage standards here, and this is just to show that if you happen to build at that 20 feet, that you can, that's the maximum, that you can actually encroach that 4 feet if needed. And then also as you go up in height, that you just have to push the facade back, depending on what level you go up. And then I transition to the US 1 overlay. In the US 1 overlay, the allowable uses in there is C2 as well as mixed use. Currently, this is the zoning site requirements. So the front setback is 25 feet for C2. Mixed use would be 10 feet or 0 feet, depending on if you're residential or commercial. And as I mentioned before, it'd be a maximum rather than a minimum. In this particular overlay, currently, the code only allows drive-thrus to be off US 1. And it limits gas stations to be off of mixed use or C2, but that also has to be along US 1. Common uses of drive-thrus can be used for fast food establishments. In some cases, there's also banks or CVS or things like that. With this proposed ordinance, the US 1 overlay would limit, it would essentially limit these gas stations to only the US 1 overlay. Also, drive-thrus would be permitted on the side and the rear of the building rather than the front, and would have to have some type of screening from the public view via landscaping. Drive-thrus would be prohibited in the front, as I mentioned, except for full-service gas stations or fuel stations, which then those would have to be required to be screened via landscaping or something from public view. And what would the intent of this particular overlay be? To encourage and provide pedestrian-friendly commercial corridor with enhanced physical appearance and clustering complementary uses. Right now, as I mentioned, the formula restaurants and formula businesses would be permitted via special exception use. Rather, some of the other overlays, as I mentioned, would be prohibited. Parking would still be encouraged to be in the rear, facades closer towards the front of the corridor, and then have civic open spaces, landscape, and tree canopies. Frontage standards, off US 1, no porches, stoops, yes, bracketed balconies, yes, forecourts, yes, arcades, no, and shop fronts, yes. And the primary streets for this would be Tequesta Drive as well as US 1, and all other streets would be secondary streets. And then we get into the last overlay, which is Village Center. Within the Village Center, you have the C2 zoning district, C3 zoning district, and mixed-use zoning district. These are the current site requirements. C2, 25 feet, C3, 15 feet, and as I mentioned, mixed use would be 0 to 10 feet depending on the use. And what is the intent for the Village Center overlay? To encourage architectural character and diversity of uses, such as residential, commercial, civic spaces, while providing pedestrian-friendly environment. Within this, essentially, if a parcel is less than, or development is less than 2 acres, then formula restaurant would be prohibited. If it meets that or exceeds that, then it'd be allowed via special exception, of course. And then formula businesses would be allowed via special exception. Parking in the rear would be encouraged, facades to be fronted towards the road, and then as well as provide civic open spaces, landscape, and tree canopies. These are the different frontage types within each one of those streets. I'm not going to go through each one of them just because it's a lot, but primary streets and secondary streets within this particular overlay would be Tequesta Drive, Bridge Road, Old Dixie Highway, Main Street, and Village Boulevard. All of the streets within this particular overlay would be considered a secondary street. These are just examples of the frontage types. You have shop fronts on the left, you have stoops, porches, arcades, bracketed balconies, and forecourts. Civic open spaces. So the way that we actually include in the ordinance, as I mentioned, there are various types of civic open spaces. So, for example, if a parcel can't meet, let's say, the square, then they might be able to take advantage of the plaza or the green or even the playground. So civic open spaces are privately maintained outdoor spaces which are accessible to the public, general public, and improve pedestrian environment. They're aesthetically pleasing and they serve as an amenity to the village as a whole. Civic open spaces for new development or additions of gross floor area of equal to 20% or more of the existing building, they shall provide equal to 5% of the total site square footage. Landscape buffers in the front and the side may be reduced no more than 25% of each side to accommodate said civic open space. And as I alluded to earlier, the civic open space now would be allowed to be counted towards your regular site requirements of the open space requirement. Also, the maintenance of the civic open space may be dedicated to the village, or it might be the responsibility of the property owner. What's an example of civic open space? So we have two parcels here, one smaller and one larger. If we happen to use the parcel on the left, which is approximately 1/4 of an acre, they would be required to provide a little bit more than 500 square feet of civic open space, which would meet the options of a forecourt or pedestrian passageway. However, if you have the plaza on the right-hand side, which is about 5.5 acres, they'd be required to provide more than 12,000 square feet of civic open space, which would meet pretty much any of the options that we provided. Another option that we provided was to include a payment in lieu. So hypothetically speaking, if a parcel they are 2 acres or below, then they can choose to opt into this particular program, which this program would allow them to essentially pay in lieu of designating that particular area for civic open space. That would be based on the appraised market value. And essentially the council would have to consider whether or not the payment in lieu would be the best served for purposes of the village. As well as this could be used for acquisition and or development of village parks, recreation, or land systems. And hypothetically speaking, if they'd like to, then they can also include a payment in lieu in conjunction with waivers, which I will get to shortly. As mentioned, we'd like to encourage parking in the rear rather than having a facade that is pushed so far back and you have all the parking in front of it. We'd like it to be more towards the pedestrian area or the corridor, and then have parking kind of hidden behind the building. This is just an example of that, where if you have a building that is fronting 2 primary streets on the left, if you have a building in the center that's fronting a primary street and a secondary street, or if you have a building that is fronting a primary street, a secondary street, and an alleyway. We've also included in the proposed ordinance here facade transparencies. So essentially this provision would be so we don't have any stark walls, blank walls. We'd like to have some type of architectural interest and have some type of windows or doors or something like that that would eliminate these blank stark walls and allow some type of facade treatment along these street frontages. And waivers. So if an applicant decided that applicant or a property owner decided that they'd like to take advantage of the waivers, which would mean that for whatever reason they can't meet the site requirements or landscape requirements, they can then apply to this council and request a waiver, which would be in conjunction with their site plan. All waivers must be granted by the village council in conjunction with the site plan, and also the waiver process cannot be used for the following: add uses that are not permitted under the overlay or zoning district, increase the allowable density or intensity, or increase the allowable building height pursuant to the site regulations. Also, the proposed code includes criteria for the waivers. And just to show what the differences are, waivers and variances, if people aren't familiar, variances are typically associated with hardships of the land. Hypothetically speaking, if you had like a circular shaped lot and everyone else had a square shaped lot, then that might be some type of hardship that you can't meet as far as site requirements or something like that. And typically, like I said, they are physical characteristics from the property. Rather, they'd also have to be approved by whether it be this council or the planning and zoning board, depending on the application. Whereas waivers are relief from the code, similar to a variance. However, they're typically associated with a development. And usually those waivers would be with the site plan, and that would be approved with the site plan. And as I mentioned, waivers cannot be used for additional uses or density, intensity, or building height, and they also have to be approved by the village council. just to summarize the process, this was heard unanimously and recommended for approval unanimously by the LPA last month. It is before this council today, April the 11th. Depending on whether or not this council moves forward with the ordinance, it would go for second reading in May. The maps that were also included in this presentation are going before the LPA next week. And then after LPA, whether they make a recommendation of approval or denial, it would then come before this council for first reading at some point. And that is it.